Richard Skipper celebrates. Every show is a celebration. Each show, Richard delivers the artists you love, showcasing what makes them unique. Never gossipy. The antidote to a sometimes hectic world. Now, here's your host, Richard Skipper.
Oh, happy Saturday night, everyone, and welcome to Richard Skipper Celebrates. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. My show is about celebrating artists and their body of worth. What makes a great artist? How do they get from point A to point B and beyond? Well, tonight, I'm going to be celebrating two artists. That's right, two artists. The first, of course, is Ron DeFore. He's written this incredible book called Growing Up in Disneyland, which we will talk about in a few moments, and also about his incredible father, Don DeFore. I'm a baby boomer, so I grew up watching Hazel and the Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Well, I didn't exactly see them when they came around the first time, but I did see them in reruns, and I'm a huge fan of both shows. But before I bring on Ron, I'm going to let him tell you a little bit of his story in his own words, and we will meet him on the other side. Here's Ron DeFore.
Hi, I'm Ron DeFore. This is a short video highlighting my book, Growing Up in Disneyland, about growing up in a Hollywood celebrity family, and my celebrity father, Don DeFore, one of America's beloved stars whose acting career spanned several decades in the golden era of Broadway, movies, and television. Don DeFore earned a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame for his role as Thorny in The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet in the early 50s.
The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. The Nelsons' next-door neighbor, Thorny, is played by Don DeFore.
Dad also played Mr. B in the 1960s TV series Hazel. In addition to Don DeFore's starring roles on Broadway, he also co-starred in movies with many golden era stars: Spencer Tracy, Charlton Heston, Doris Day, Elizabeth Scott, Gail Storm, Robert Cummings, Rock Hudson, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Bob Hope and Lucille Ball, John Wayne, and many others. Here's a memorable clip from Dad's co-starring role with Ronald Reagan.
Now look here, you made her cry and I'm not going to stand for it.
What are you going to do besides making this grandstand play for her to hear?
Oh, brother, you've really had too much.
You are a cat.
A cat? I thought you said I was a sea lion.
You are a cat, and I am a blackbird.
So you're a blackbird. All right, little birdie, fly away and sober up.
So my book is unusual. It's a hybrid between an autobiography and a biography. The book's title, Growing Up in Disneyland, is not only a metaphor for my life in a celebrity family, but it is also literal, as Disneyland in Anaheim, California, was the DeFore kids' backyard when Dad owned Don DeFore's Silver Banjo barbecue restaurant in Frontierland. That's Dad with his brother Vern, who managed the Silver Banjo. And how about that? A chicken dinner for only $1.75. That's our family riding in Disneyland's opening day parade in the Autopia cars, July 15th, 1955. And that's me and my sister Dawn riding with Walt Disney himself in a Disneyland Christmas parade. My mom was also an entertainer as the featured vocalist for both the Henry Busse Orchestra and Art Kassel and his Kassels in the Air in the late 1930s and early 1940s. She recorded with both orchestras and made I'm a Little Teapot famous. At my parents' wedding, Judy Garland was her matron of honor. My book includes dozens of fascinating, sometimes unbelievable experiences, like getting to meet the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, the Beach Boys, Robin Williams, Jonathan Winters, and Dad, as president of the Television Academy, selling the first national broadcast of the Emmy Awards to NBC in 1954. After many years of sharing my life's adventures with friends, clients, and Disney enthusiast groups like this one with Brother Dave, many had the same comment: you should write a book. And so I have.
And tonight we're going to talk about that book. Ron, it's great to meet you. Finally, I've been enjoying your book so much. And before we start talking about the book and your life, I read today that Disneyland is opening on April 1st. So they're getting back to some semblance of normalcy on the West Coast. But we are in the midst of the pandemic. And before we talk about your past, I want to talk about where you are now. How are you doing really in the midst of all this?
I'm doing fine. I mean, physically, I'm doing fine. I could shed a few weights like many people my age.
Good.
But as far as, I haven't had the pandemic myself. I've been vaccinated twice, so I feel safe. And but I am getting a little antsy. I do like to travel with my wife, Lori, and others. And so I'm looking forward to, in a few months when I think that that's safe to do a little bit of traveling.
And where do you live right now?
We live in Haymarket, Virginia. We came to the East Coast in 1984, which I read about in my book. As you know, it came as working for the federal government. And so we've lived in Northern Virginia since then. But since retiring, I wanted to move a bit further out where it's a little bit more pristine and quiet from all the rumble downtown.
Now, as everyone's sitting around to watch tonight's show, I remember those days of destination television, where the family would come together and we would watch these great television shows. Our family, I saw the photograph of you and your father when he was putting your first, I think, color television set into your home. What was your earliest memory of seeing your father on television? And what are your memories of relating to the fact that that man on television was your father, although he was not playing your father on TV?
Good question. I remember it vividly, and I was probably only about 4 years old, watching a movie that he co-starred in, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, with Spencer Tracy. And there's a scene when they crash and both of his arms are broken. And I remember, crawling up in his lap and crying and saying, "Dad, are you okay?" And at that age of 4, I'm not sure it quite clicked in as to what an actor was and what reality was. Mm-hmm. But I must correct you. That was a black and white, 26-inch black and white that he was installing. Now, he should have been installing a color one a couple of years later when Hazel was one of those shows that premiered color. It went from black and white the first season to color the rest of the seasons. But if you saw in that photo, that was all built-in furniture that my dad
Absolutely.
and his brother made. My dad was great at building furniture. Anyway, so it was the largest black and white you could get, and at that time you couldn't get color to, put into a built-in cabinetry like that.
Now, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there was an entire episode of Hazel that was built around color television sets, because this was the whole new direction that television was going in. When your dad and Shirley Booth appeared on the cover of TV Guide magazine, it became the fastest growing what episode is the word I'm looking for, but edition, I guess, of TV Guide. And if you can talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I have the letter from the president of TV Guide at that time. It was October 12th, 1961. As you mentioned, it was Shirley Booth and my dad as Hazel and Mr. B. And the letter states that issue had sold more copies than any other issue ever sold. So it's a great family memorabilia piece, and it spoke a lot to the popularity of the show.
Now, one of the things, Ron, that I've admired so much about you from reading your book is the fact that you have made it your mission, it seems like, to preserve your father's legacy so that new generations will know who your father is and was, and the fact that you have a website devoted to your father, this incredible book, which, as you said in your introduction, is not only your memoir, but it's his unpublished autobiography. When did you first discover, which came first, you discovering the manuscripts that he wrote, or the fact that you wanted to write your story?
Well, my brother and I, my brother is also the co-trustee of the family trust. So he and I worked together on a lot of the family issues. And he and I have had my dad's memoirs that were going to be titled Hollywood-DeFore and After.
Great title.
On our computers. You know, when he wrote the book, that was before computers. So it was all on his manual typewriter that he would send to a service, and they would type it into a computer. But thank God we have it digitally. But for more than 20, 25 years, my brother and I decided we're not going to do anything. It needs a lot of editing. There were great stories in there, but it needed a lot of editing and a lot of trimming down. It was over 850 pages. So we didn't think we'd do anything with it. And it wasn't until, and I never thought I'd write a book. I mean, that's the weird thing is that for decades, I wasn't that great a writer, although I got into public relations, and you better be a good writer. But what I did is I was a good manager of people. So as I built my company, I just surrounded myself and hired excellent writers and learned a lot from them. But I didn't have the time. You know, running a business was full-time and more. And it wasn't until I was slipping into retirement. I was on a walk one day. I remember it specifically. And after many years of giving presentations and people saying, you know, Ron, you should write a book. You got so many stories, even beyond your dad. I just thought, you know what? I'm going to do it. Now, here's the last thing that's the really weird thing. I was at least a month into researching and, you know, outlining and how would I construct the book. And I was researching my dad's work before I was born. I mean, he had 2 decades of stuff that he did long before. And a lightning bolt hit me and I thought, why am I doing this? I have all the things that my dad did in his own words on my computer. So that was the epiphany that I had. And I just said, man, I just started digging into it and pulling out. And my brother helped me quite a bit as we went through each piece to find, you know, figure out what's appropriate, what's not, what are people going to be interested in. And that's how that all pieced together.
Now, one of the things that you've said yourself is that you have had this Forest Gumpian, I think I made up a new word.
Yeah, I like it.
Yes, Forest Gumpian type of a life where you mentioned earlier. I'm going to share something also. Thank you for putting this out there. A little video that I've got here. There's no sound on this, but we'll see this very quickly. And this is your family meeting the Beatles.
Oh.
Can you tell us a little bit about your memories from this?
Yeah, I had just turned 13 and I got a 8mm movie camera for my birthday. And the unfortunate thing is I had not had a lot of time to practice. So unfortunately, parts of that 50-foot roll of film is a little dark. There's some great pieces that are better. But yeah, so I brought that with me, and that was a private party in Brentwood at Phil Spector's mother-in-law's house in Brentwood, and it was a fundraiser. And the interesting thing is that it turns out that film you just showed, the whole 50 feet, is the only moving, not video, but moving photos of that event, because media was not allowed in there. The only thing that really came out of there was the Beatles' own, or probably Capitol Records photographers. So I have 4, black and whites of the family meeting there. But that was, and it's really interesting, is it was really neat at the time. But as time went on, and now I look back at it and think, I got to meet the Beatles. It is so much more impactful now that I'm older than when.
More importantly, Ron, they got to meet you.
Right.
Now, I know that you said that you were a press agent, publicist, and of course, if you are in that field, you have to be a great writer. But were you always a great writer, or has this developed as the years have gone on?
No, I was not a good writer, and actually I feared writing. Mm-hmm. And it's very weird that I got into public relations, although there's a lot of other skills that fortunately I had, and I think I excelled at, media relations and so forth. But when I got to writing, I just was not. I had a fear of it. So when I first came to Washington, I remember joining this public relations group, and they'd have guest speakers, and they had a guy named Jim Lake, who was a big advisor and PR guy to, I think, Nixon, some president or something. I can't remember. And somebody asked him a question about writing press releases, and he said, "You know what? I've never written a press release in my life." And it was like a saving moment for my dad. I said, "Wow, I can make it in PR without having to be."
Well, let me ask you, Ron, what brought you into that field?
Well, as you mentioned Forrest Gump earlier, my whole life has been like that feather in the beginning of Forrest Gump. I just went where the wind blew and had a great time most of the time. And so and as you know, one of the chapters is my 20 careers. I just went from thing to thing and spent about 2 years in each. And when I got bored with it, I moved on. And so when I got into PR, it was my first position in federal government. They wanted somebody that knew media. Mm-hmm. And I had worked at KTLA TV. I had worked at Paramount Studios. So I knew media. Little do they know that is completely different than being able to do media relations. But hey, it helped me get the job. I learned as I went. I did some press conferences in LA that actually wound up on CNN nationally. And people in Washington were going, "Wow, we got to get this guy back here." And that's what happened. I got promoted to Director of Public Affairs at the Peace Corps and had a great time, promoting a great agency. And then went into two other positions within the Reagan administration in public affairs. So, I mean, it all kind of happened. And I learned as I went. One thing I learned from my dad is to always watch people around you, especially if they're better than you. And like a chameleon, I've always considered myself a chameleon, that if I'm around somebody that's really great long enough, I will pick up some of that stuff.
Well, speaking of which, I mean, do you consider your father your first mentor? A lot of people go into the family business. Both of your parents, your mother was a great singer. Your father, of course, we see the body of his work. And you've been able to find recordings of your mom since all of this. What were the lessons that you learned from both of your parents about this business, and as far as either gravitating towards it or moving away from it?
I learned a lot from both of them, but I can't really, it's a good question. I can't really put my finger on anything specific to the entertainment business. the great lessons I learned from them is that they brought us up as close as possible to like regular folks. Okay, not like wealthy people in Brentwood or Beverly Hills.
Mm-hmm.
And as I write in the book, that many of my friends that were brought up that way, that did get whatever they asked for, they got the Fender guitar, they got the amplifier, whatever. When I wanted mine, I had to borrow the money from my parents and then pay it off, mowing the lawn or painting the house. Well, nobody's kids in Brentwood were doing that, or at least not many that I knew of. And it really,
I think that your father was very much like Thorny, the character he played in The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet.
Yes,
your parents built your family home together. Your mom did the interior design, all of the work, and your father was a very hands-on type of guy.
He was. He had a workshop. He made a lot of the early American furniture in our first home on Mandeville Canyon there. And so that's the kind of stuff. It was a really good, solid upbringing. And it's really only by happenstance that the early part of my career, I got into television. And but then after that, actually, it's because of my dad, I got out of television. At Paramount, from Paramount, I went to Billy Jack Productions, and it was about that time that I really got tired of people saying, kind of whispering, and well, we know why he got that position, as if my dad had something to do with me getting the job. Now, he opened a couple of doors in a couple of instances, but
you mentioned in the book that you and Dick Van Dyke's son are both in the opening episode of Hazel, and I think you got $36 for your efforts for that.
Yes,
yes,
that was the extra minimum at that time.
But did it feel like work, or did it feel like play for you?
Oh, it was like play. I mean, it wasn't work. It actually was a great learning experience. I had been on many sets before, but not for a full day. So, as you know, in any filmmaking, what winds up being 15 seconds on the screen can take you 4 hours, if for whatever reason, lighting or the actors don't remember their lines. And the line thing is one thing I learned. I watched the one scene right before our scene where Hazel is asking the balloon vendor to put helium in a football. And the guy that had the little part of the helium vendor just had not studied his lines. And to me, my memory is that it took like 3 hours for them to do what wound up being, 20 seconds. And it amazed me. But my dad was very good at remembering his lines, very rarely blew a line. And me and my sister Dawn actually helped him many nights after dinner. He'd say, okay, who wants to help me with my lines? And he'd have them all typed out on 3x5 cards, and we'd take turns, reading the parts and letting him practice his lines.
And was it fun for you to see the finished product after that was all done, having worked on those lines with your father?
Probably not as much fun as other people might have. And that's one of the points, as you know, I make in the book, is that celebrities don't awe me because I grew up with it. I'm one of the worst people on knowing celebrities' names, just because I never knew that it was important to remember because they were all around me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I said, more importantly, that the Beatles got to meet you. Because believe it or not, I think along those lines. The one thing that I've learned doing what I do is that everybody has the same hopes, the same desires, the same wishes. Some may be a little off the beaten path. But one of the things that I also loved learning about your father was this was a man who truly paid his dues. It didn't just happen. He worked his way going from the Midwest to California, going to the Pasadena Playhouse, and winning a scholarship out of, I think, 300 boys and girls.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, he had been in many church plays and school plays and community plays, and many of which were directed by his mom, my grandmother. And so she was a big force in his life too, encouraging it. Whereas, a lot of actors and actresses have parents that say, "Don't get into that. That's a foolish career. You'll be starving all your life." So he had a lot of encouragement. He did really well, and he was very fortunate to be able to, get that scholarship. And Pasadena Playhouse and School of Theater was, and still may be, I don't know, it's like one of the top 3 in the world. Mm-hmm. So he got a lot of basic training. And he also did a lot of Broadway, co-starred in 4 major productions.
Well, I just want to move back. Your dad and your brother took the car. They went out west. They lived with their sister.
Right.
And then he auditions, gets in, and it was William Hammerstein, Oscar Hammerstein II, who brought him to Broadway.
Right. Yes, they saw my dad and other actors doing a production at the Playhouse, and that was very common in those days. Mm-hmm. By the way, for the talent scouts and directors to go to Pasadena, probably other playhouses as well, but Pasadena was very important for them, and they would find new talent that way. And so they asked my dad if he would be interested in being in a production on Broadway, gave him $20 and said, "We'll see you in Broadway." So he actually had to hitchhike past a part of the way.
But he did do a lot of stock before he got to Broadway.
Oh yeah. He
going back to paying his dues.
And that's what helps. I mean, nowadays, even in the last 30 years, you hear of people becoming a star, and they really didn't have, any of this really heavy early training, which I think is very important.
And then, he had the show didn't last that long, but a few years later, he ended up in one of Broadway's biggest comedy hits, and that was The Male Animal.
Right.
And that particular show has a special meaning for 2 special things that I'll talk about. The first was after the show closed, it took him to Chicago, and he was in Chicago for 10 weeks, and he met a very special person there. If you can talk about that.
Right. What was very common, it's still common to today, is if you've got a hit on Broadway and it closes on Broadway, then it tours the country. And you're right. And when he went to Chicago, before he left New York, a couple of the people that were in the production weren't going to go on the road. And one of them kept on saying, "Don, when you're in Chicago, you got to look up my very good friend, Marion Holmes. She sings with an orchestra there in Chicago at the Biltmore Hotel." And so anyway, towards the end of the run in Chicago, my dad and a few other people in the production make it over there. And that was a great part of my dad's life, as he writes in my book, that he was now on top of the world. So he was given top-notch treatment. They gave him a table like right up in front to watch the orchestra. Well, that's when he got to see and then ultimately meet Marion Holmes, the featured vocalist with Art Kassel and his Kassels in the Air. And as my dad always said, it was the longest hello in history.
But they eventually decided that they would get married, and they picked a very special day, Valentine's Day.
Yes.
So that I think that, was it your mom who said that way he would remember the anniversary?
Yeah, right. It was a great line. My mom had a lot of great lines too. Great sense of humor, and she just good chemistry between both of them.
But when they got married, and you mentioned this in your introduction as well, Judy Garland was the matron of honor.
Well, yeah, because my mom was from Chicago. My dad was out making pictures in Hollywood, so they were going to get married in Hollywood on Valentine's Day, as you said. And my mom didn't have any friends out there. So she had dated David Rose, a orchestra leader, and knew him well. And I think she called David and said, "Do you suppose your wife would be willing to stand up in my wedding?" Well, the wife at the time was Judy Garland.
But it was either your father or your mother that was also very friendly with her agent at the time. Am I correct?
That's new to me. That may be, but I don't know whether that's true.
It seems like I read that somewhere. And then another incredible thing happened. Your father was asked to be in the film version of The Male Animal, which was very unusual that the Broadway performer would end up doing the movie.
Yeah, that was. It's an interesting twist because they changed the name of the movie. It became She's Working Her Way Through College. Changed the storyline a bit, but not enough to make it a whole new movie. And the producer and director actually consulted with my dad on many different issues. Initially, they asked him to play a certain role, and he said, "No, I've already done that. I'd like to play the role that he played." Mm-hmm. And so he actually got to switch the role that he was going to play, and that was the scene that you showed earlier with Ronald Reagan, and that's how our family got to be good friends with him.
Now, your father campaigned for Ronald Reagan, and you also were a part of his administration. Am I correct?
Yeah, my first position in federal government was not a political position, but and my dad kept on saying, "Ron, I can send your resume to the White House." And if you recall, I said earlier that I got out of the film business because I didn't want people to think I was wherever I was because of my dad. I wanted to do things that I could call my own. So I resisted that for 2 years. And people, that I was working with are going, "You are a fool. That's the name of the game. I mean, your dad is best friends with the president. You're not." Anyway, so that's how the next three positions became political. But my dad had done a lot for Reagan, not only for president, he campaigned for governor as well. But it was quite a delight when I finally said to my dad, "Okay, send the resume in." I got a call 2 weeks later from the head of personnel at the White House. He said, "We got to talk." I come over there and he's just effusive he says, "You don't know how much your dad is loved in the Republican Party and must be very good friends with the president, because the president himself walked your resume down to my office and said, 'See what you can do for this guy.'"
Now, you mentioned also in your book that your father was not able to serve in the military, but he was a very patriotic man, and he put his energies anywhere he could in terms of helping the cause. If you can elaborate on that for a moment.
Well, he was very patriotic. He had some surgery, a life-threatening surgery earlier in his life, which kicked him out of the Army. He was only in for 9 days when they discovered that he had this. But he did a lot of things in support of our country. He went over to Vietnam for quite a while with USO and supported that as well. And that's some of the stuff he instilled in me, even to this day.
Now, as far as your father's film work is concerned, he was always that dependable, almost guy next door type of character. Out of all the films, the other night I was watching Romance on the High Sea, was on Turner Classic Movies just this past week. Did you have a favorite film of your father's? And what was it about that film that you never get tired of watching?
Well, my favorite and the family favorite has been It Happened on Fifth Avenue, where with Gail Storm and Alan Hale Jr., Charles Ruggles, a lot of great stars, and it's very much like Miracle on 34th Street, and now Turner Classic Movies has actually now named it as one of its classic Christmas movies. So, but here's a little thing I'll tell you about that readers of my book already know is I wasn't really into all the stuff that he was doing, films, or there are episodes of Hazel that I'm sure I've never seen. Now, the two Hazel Facebook groups that I participate in are probably falling over and fainting because they can repeat every line in it. But I just wasn't into it. I was into my own thing. So this writing of the book has been so therapeutic in so many ways. I have learned far more about my dad in the last 2 years than I ever knew. I've watched far more of his acting in films and television than I ever had. And it's blown my mind. I'm just going, why didn't I watch this?
Well, you bring up a very interesting point here. I mean, today is the anniversary of my own father passing away.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
19 years ago today. But how fortunate you are that your father is there. You can see your father on camera and on screen. I want to ask you, either writing the book or after the book was published, what was the biggest surprise that you've come to know about your father that you had never really thought about prior to writing the book?
Richard, this is why I presume you are so popular, because you are asking really, really good questions. The biggest surprise, and this is an easy answer, but it's a great question. The biggest surprise to me is how many fans are out there for my dad. I had really no idea, and that's why it was a struggle to write it. I had people for decades suggesting that I write something, and my answer was the same every time. I said, look, had I been inclined in, let's say, the mid-'70s, when Don DeFore, the name, and Don DeFore's photo was recognizable to most Americans that had paid attention to TV and films. But when it got into the 80s, 90s, I said, it's a very narrow market. You have to be at a certain age and have to have watched certain things on television. So I said, I just don't think there's a broad enough interest. And so even while I was writing this, I was going back and forth between, do I keep this in? Do people really care? And keep it. You can imagine this too, that it was tough because the book is not only about him, it's about me. So there were actually more times I was writing something about me, and I kept on going, who cares about me? And I went back and forth, and it's been such a blessing now that the book has been out for 1.5 years to see all the comments on Facebook and the comments on Amazon, where people have now reassured me that the way I wrote it and the things that I included about not only my dad, but me, were pretty close to perfect. They loved hearing about, my dad and my perspective, and then the things that I did afterwards. So that really keeps surprising me, and it's a wonderful surprise.
Now, I want to talk about your process, and then I want to talk about certain key moments in your father's life. The process of writing this book and incorporating your story along with your father's story. How did you go about doing this? Did you share what you wrote with others before you decided that was finished? Moving on, did you work in a linear fashion? What was the process like for you?
Well, it was a process of more than 20 years for that amount of time, and now longer. My brother and I had been giving these presentations to various Disney enthusiast groups, which mainly focused on our restaurant and our 5 years experience in Disneyland. But at the very beginning, I had named our presentation Growing Up in Disneyland. Okay, I thought it was catchy, and it kind of encompassed everything that the presentation would be about. And so we did the big Disney D23. We did that twice at the big convention in Anaheim. But there's another group called the Disneyland Fan Club that has had us there now 4 times. And just a week ago, I did a 5th one via Zoom that they recorded, and they're going to play to the membership. But what happened with that group is each time, and I would do this with my brother, I would say, Dave, okay, they want us back again. We've got to, add some new stuff in here. These people have to be getting tired of the same old stories. So very early on, I had learned by talking to many people in my life that they're interested in like meeting the Beatles or, just the stuff that we got to do because we were in a celebrity family. So as we started.
But Ron, there are so many spokes to this wheel. There's also the Disney fans. There are a lot of the fans of your father's work from Hazel. Then there's the Ozzie and Harriet fans. It just builds and builds and builds.
Yep. And so, it was all of the above and people coming up, and we'd chat afterwards and during Q&A, and people just saying, God, you got to write a book. And, it wasn't until 20 years later that I had the time. Then it hit me. I went, I'm going to write that book. But
I have another presentation that I'm going to share with everyone right now. And this is specifically about your father's restaurant and Disney. And then we'll talk about this on the other side.
Okay.
So my first question is, do you like barbecue?
The family loves barbecue.
That's great. Now, your father served on, he was on the board for the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and along with Walt Disney. And Walt Disney asked your father to open this restaurant. And I want to stress to everyone, he didn't license his name, folks. He was hands-on with this restaurant. So that's the title of your book. You pretty much grew up, with this restaurant going on. What are some of your memories of this restaurant opening? And I think it lasted, was it 5 years? The restaurant?
Yeah, 5 years, from 1957 and 1962. And we have great memories. We got tired of the attractions, though, very quickly. And I say this to Disney groups, and they like fall out of their chairs. We go every week. How could you get, and people have actually invited me, and I really have no interest to go there now because we spent so much time. But the fun part was what kids would do in the park after they got totally bored with the attractions. My favorite being our parking space was right behind the Jungle Cruise ride. So if I brought a friend, I'd let my parents walk ahead, and then I'd say, come over here, let me show you something. And I'd take them into the bushes, and we'd get next to the giraffe or the tigers or whatever, and wait for one of the boats to come by, and then jump out with scratching our underarms like we were monkeys. And then we'd hightail it out of there. But you could do that back in those days. Nowadays you'd be in jail. But we'd go on the sky ride with the cups of water and pour water on people. Like
kids, you were doing what kids do. That's
great. They would actually use us sometimes for testing rides. They used to have a flying saucer ride in Tomorrowland. And at one point, they called over to the restaurant to my Uncle Vern, and they said, "Hey, are any of your kids over there right now?" "Oh, yeah, the DeFore kids are here." "Well, send a couple over to Tomorrowland. We need to have them test the ride." So we were like on these plywood platforms, with boxes of nails to even out the weight and everything. And so it just, a lot of fun, but after a while, I had other things going on in my life in those days. So one of the chapters is, gee, do we have to go to Disneyland again? I do have to caution, though, to Disney enthusiasts. This is one big thing that I've learned the hard way. My rating for the book would probably be a perfect 5 on Amazon if it weren't for 3 pinheads that gave me a 3 saying, "Don't buy the book because this is not a book all about Disneyland." So I've now asked the publisher, I said, I want that to be the first sentence. You wouldn't normally put a negative to promote anything.
Well, it's a metaphor for the life that your family was living.
And as I've said to people that, only a few, but I said, you don't judge a book by its cover. And if you read the first line, anyway, otherwise, the predominance of the comments are wonderful, and it's got a 4.6 rating. And so that's a lot of the stuff that just really surprised me. And I had no expectations. I really didn't care how many copies would sell or what the ratings were to me. And when that bolt of lightning hit me and I decided to write it, it was all for my dad. It was a work of love, still is.
Well, there's so many wonderful stories in the book also about the circumstances that come up in a person's life. Obviously, your father had the talent, he had the gravitas, he had the work ethic, and there were a couple of occasions where he happened to be at the right place at the right time. 2 of those I'll talk about, and that we have already talked about Walt Disney. What was it that Walt Disney saw in your father that wanted him to open a restaurant in Disneyland?
Well, let's back up a second. He was not only on the board of the Television Academy, but then he was voted in as president, and he served for 2 consecutive years. And his first year, he did something that even Walt and other board members had tried and failed, and that was selling the Emmy Awards to NBC, nationally broadcast Emmy Awards. Prior to that, it was just a local LA and New York broadcast. So he sold the very first national broadcast of the Emmy Awards, which aired in 1955. And many, many people called or telegrammed, and it was Walt Disney that called my dad and told my dad, I can't tell you how many times we tried to even give the show away and we couldn't do it. I want to meet the guy that was able to do that. So he invited my dad out to a personal tour of the Burbank studios. My dad says, can I bring Bud Colson, who was the PR guy of the Television Academy? Can I bring Bud with me? Oh, sure. I'd love to meet him. So they go out there. And I mentioned, from there on, the rest is history. We were in the opening day parade. It goes to an offer a year later. But the offer was made by Bud Colson. Bud Colson calls my dad in 1956 and says that there's some space available. I'm now working for Walt. Walt hired me to manage all of the lessees inside Disneyland. And when we found out that there's space for a restaurant, I thought of you because of your many stories of talking about how you cooked your way through college. So that's how that came together. He said, there's one provision. Walt wants you to take a restaurant management course. So my dad and Uncle Vern took a course at UCLA Extension.
And he got his license, and the rest is history. Let's talk, before we do run out of time, I would assume, at least from my perspective, that your father today is most well known for Hazel. Here he is with Shirley Booth. Your father almost did not get the role of Mr. B. And if you can talk about the circumstances, of course, don't give everything away. It's all in the book, folks. We want you to buy the book. But the circumstances that led to your father getting the role, and the rest is history.
Well, he had just come off of 5 years successfully performing the role of Thorny on Ozzie and Harriet. Many people have asked, did he leave? Did they kick him out? Did he want more money? No, the relationship with the Nelsons continued for many years after that, and they were always friends. But my dad wanted to move on, as many actors, not only back then, but still today, they want to move on to bigger and better things. My dad didn't know quite what it would be. It happened to turn out to be a restaurant in Disneyland. But around 1961, 60, that's when my dad's agent, they were on a short trip together. And he mentioned that, he said, I think we're going to get a call asking you to play the lead role, and described the sitcom. And the agent said, I'm going to advise you not to take it. Shirley Booth just won an Oscar. She's going to obviously be the star. She's going to get all the great lines and everything. Don, you have earned your right to get your own star or co-starring role in your own series. And my dad was, taking that lead. And sure enough, he got the call. And that was great advice. The sad thing is that agent died like a week later. It was really tragic. But those parting remarks were very important, because my dad went into that interview saying, look, I'm inclined not to do this, and here's why. If I were to do this, I want to have equal not only billing, but time, lines, laugh lines. You know how that works. I don't want to be upstaged by Shirley. And they agreed to that. And I think that actually helped the formula of the show, because as many people have noted on my Facebook pages, is that my dad was just as much a part of that chemistry as Shirley was.
And then when they ended their run on NBC and it was picked up by, was it CBS?
Yeah.
Then your father was, and that cast for the most part, the supporting cast, along with your father, were all let go.
Yeah, and it wasn't a real pleasurable way that Dad found out about that, but it was.
Read the book, folks. Don't give it away.
Yeah, right. It was a cost-cutting measure, and a stupid one at that. As can be verified by the hundreds of comments that I've got. I not only have my own Facebook pages, but I participate a lot. There's 3 different Hazel Facebook pages, and there's a couple Ozzie and Harriet. So I participate in those too. And the overwhelming majority say that the last season was not to be watched.
I'm part of that group. I want to ask you, with everything that your father accomplished, and he accomplished so much, were there any major disappointments in his life that did not come to fruition that he had aspired to?
There was a lot. My dad and my brother and the whole family kind of joked about the many business ventures. And I use business very loosely, because my dad, even though he's very successful with a restaurant in Disneyland, it's hard to say this, but he really didn't have a business mind. He had an incredible creative mind and humor and so many things I'd love to have. But business was not one of his. That I've always thought that's why I succeeded in business, because I always had my dad, somewhere on the side of my head, and I'd go, no, I'm not going to do it that way. and so I tell a great story, and I won't tell it here because you got to read it in the book. But the whole game show idea that he came up with, and there were some failed attempts at a lot of different things. But as I got older and successful in business and reading a lot of business books, you read that every person that's been successful had many, many more failures. That's true. So I wasn't as critical about him as I was when I was younger.
Now, getting back to the book once again, when did you know that the book was finished and that it was ready to publish?
Well, there were probably 4 or 5 or 6 different drafts, and I had 2 great people helping review and editing. One I've already mentioned, my brother David, and a very good friend of mine who always said he wanted to go unnamed. So I'll just say a very, very good friend. He actually worked for me in my company, and he was my deputy in one of the positions in government, and an excellent writer, one of the best writers. As I mentioned earlier, I always like to surround myself by great writers. He was the best, and I learned a lot from him. So as a favor, he agreed to go through 2 different drafts, added a lot, had a lot of good thoughts. And so it was, I don't know, I can't remember. It's the 5th or 6th time when everybody had their eyeballs on it. The publisher's editor had gone through it, and I finally looked at it and I go, it's done. No more tinkering.
So what's next for you, Ron?
I don't know. I mean, people have urged me to write another book. The neatest, one of the neat things for any author is a lot of the comments saying they love the style. One person put it like they said, Ron, it was like you were sitting right next to me telling me stories. And I've since learned that that's called conversational writing. So I guess I'm a good conversational writer. The problem is I've already told my story. It's not like I can write a book about another life I had. So
when the time is right, it's going to come to you. I can't believe this, but we are at the end of our show.
Oh my God.
I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for telling your father's story and yours as well. I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I hope you all had a great time. If you did, and if you don't mind, please post a comment on the platform that you're listening on, whether it be a podcast or YouTube, or you can go to my website, richardskipper.com. Sign my guest book with your thoughts about the show. That helps to boost this in other markets. And if you're around tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, I'm going to be celebrating Sarah Louise Lazarus. She's a phenomenal director of cabaret and theater here in New York. I also end every show by telling everyone to go out and do something nice for somebody else without expecting anything in return. Go to your Facebook friends list, and the 6th name that pops up, pick up the phone and call that person. Not a text, not an email, not a private message, a phone call. As my dear friend David Friedman says, we're all in the same, we're going through this together, but we're not in the same boat. You never know what somebody else is going through right now. Reach out. And Ron, again, thank you for being here tonight. I want to give you the final word. Anything that we've talked about that you want to expound upon, anything that we didn't talk about that you wish we had, or just any message that you want to put out to everyone who's watching now. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And again, you're a great interview. It's always a pleasure to be interviewed by somebody who's done their homework and asked good questions. I'd like to leave everybody with what I found, again, another surprise that I had that nobody knew what the last year or couple of years have brought to all of us. And that the book is a great escape from a lot of this stuff that's going on. And I won't be specific. Everybody's got their own perspective of it, but it's been a crazy mixed up world. And many people have commented that this was a great refrain from all of that. And especially neat that the book brings you back to what I call the golden era, the 50s and early 60s, and a lot of views from my father and me that make it come to life. So If you're looking for that kind of thing, go to growingupindisneyland.com, and you'll be able to see a bunch of stuff and order the book if you want.
And it is a great read. Thank you so much. Make it a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you.